Who were the authors of the Constitution? Well, one thing's been true since biblical times. We read in the Bible how conquering kings, even the army sent by God, destroyed the evidence of the existence of the nation that they conquered. That was the way it was done. The conquering army destroyed every bit of evidence that that nation ever existed. Well, that hasn't changed today. The thought still exists. The motive exists. The means, time, and patience to destroy the evidence of a conquered nations have changed in these modern times. Today we call it censoring. Control of what you can see and what you can't see on the internet are all signs of one power attempting to obliterate the existence of those they consider enemies. You got to be blind not to see it today. Which brings us to the question, what can we trust in this age of advanced knowledge, censoring, and control? Why do governments around the world see a need to control information in the computer age when all the information in the world lies at our fingertips? Well, we're going to take a look at quotes from three of the people who helped shape the Constitution. They had no way of knowing we would one day have computers and the internet to link people from all around the world, ideas, and all this information together. You shouldn't be surprised to see the authors of the Constitution did see an age where information would be controlled, censored, and those authors of the Constitution actually told us how dangerous that threat will be. I mean, they were spot on. Really surprised me when I put this together. So today we're going to take a look at some famous quotes from three of the main contributors to the Constitution. Our goal here is to learn how to collect information about the authors of the Constitution, which provides us with the right ammunition and information to defend the Constitution. I mean, that's what a patriot's supposed to be, a defender of the Constitution. The most important aspect is to learn about events and experiences that shaped the minds of the people who constructed the U.S. government and what their hopes and fears were, so we can properly interpret every section, sentence, and word in the Constitution. So let's begin our journey. And of course, I'm going to provide some useful links in the description of this video. Before we start collecting quotes and other material written by the original authors of the Constitution, it's probably a really good idea to find out who the original authors of the Constitution were. So how do we get a list of those authors? Well, we can just take a search engine and put in constitutional authors and hit enter and see what we find. Of course, you know, it's going to come up with a couple of ads first. One of the best places to start, which is debatable, is a .gov website that is supposed to have unbiased material. But in this case, I think it's pretty reliable. So we go to archives.com, meet the framers of the Constitution, and what do we find when we click on there? Well, it's basically a list of all of the delegates that were sent to the convention to come up with a framework for a government that was going to be of the people, by the people. Now, there's a lot of names on here that are unfamiliar, which is like really good. And then you got to kind of look for the familiar names, like Alexander Hamilton. Let's click on that as an example, just to see what we find. You know, he was born in 1757 on the island. And it goes on bearing his letters. So it gives a brief history of Alexander Hamilton. And it also, this page has basically all of the delegates of from New York. They decided to divide it into. So that's some good information. As a matter of fact, it'd be interesting to take some of these other people, put it into a search engine, and find out what their comments were about what went into the Constitution, what they agreed with, what they disagreed with, what they thought was important, and everything else. But we need this information to really find out what is behind the Constitution. So we've got this website. It's a government website. So what else do we find in here? So we got the .gov, and then I just looked at a couple of these. Who wrote the Constitution? Constitution.laws.com. A lot of these sound like good, reputable websites to gather information from. Wikipedia, I don't know. What's your personal opinion? Do you trust Wikipedia? But Britannica.com, I think you got to pay to get on that website, but I already took a look at this one, so we'll take a quick look at this one. Who wrote the Constitution? Who wrote the Constitution? Unveiling the Architects of America's Founding Document. And over here, the print is a little small. I already kind of went through this ahead of time, so I'm going to get into where they decided to change into some print to where you could actually read. Okay, the Constitution was not written by any one individual, but rather it was drafted and revised by several key figures in American history during a historic meeting in Philadelphia known as the Constitutional Convention. And that convention was actually held in 1787. So, since they won the War of Independence in the 1770s, it was like 10 years before they actually wrote the Constitution. So you can gather a whole bunch of information on here. Primary authors of the Constitution were James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And it goes on and gives a little bit of explanation about Madison, about Hamilton, about Jay, and then there's explains that they were the primary ones. The other 52 delegates also played a significant part in shaping the Constitution. And then, of course, there was Benjamin Franklin, and of course, we've got Gouverneur Morris, and a couple other ones, and of course I mentioned George Washington as a framer of the Constitution. And we know that these figures basically have a whole big collection of quotes that we can take a look at to get an idea of what they had in mind when they actually wrote that Constitution. So there you go. You can search out, find out who had a hand in writing the Constitution, and start looking at some of the famous quotes that they said in trying to explain why they thought it was important to put, the information into the Constitution. And then once we understand that, we get a better understanding of what the Constitution is all about. Well, the next obvious step would be to start collecting quotes or information, books or whatever, written memoirs from the original authors of the Constitution. So you can search those people individually for famous quotes or just information in general about them, see what you can turn up. Or you can just look for famous quotes from the constitutional authors. And I'm just going to do this as a quick example to show you how to get started. So you can put it in there, and of course, you got the ads at the beginning, but you can look at, your favorite sites to see what quotes are available. And there's a lot of information here. There's a lot of sources available. A lot of the work's already been done with you, so you can start using them. Goodreads just basically has the quote. And with Goodreads, I guess what you got to do is, well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's a quote by James Madison. And it's kind of tricky sometimes on websites to copy and paste, but you can, copy this, put it into your favorite photo editor, find a picture of Madison, and, come up with your own set of quotes. Or we're going to take a look at another one, this A to Z Quotes, which is a pretty good source. And this gives you a good example. It looks nice, when you got a picture, and then, you got the quote underneath there and the author's name. So they've already done a pretty good job of putting that together. And then you can right-click, and you can copy the image and paste it into your favorite photo editor and save it. And it says right on here A to Z Quotes, so you give them a little bit of credit. But it also has the quote right underneath it, so you can quickly copy, highlight, do a right click, you can copy, and you can paste this into your own notes or put it into your favorite photo editor and find a better picture of Madison or better frame or whatever. But there's a lot of different ways that you can start collecting these quotes and finding out, what was their thought pattern and putting all of this information into the Constitution. So that ought to get you pretty much started. It's just basically pretty easy. Just start searching. The first author we're going to take a look at is John Adams, who is one of the younger and more radical thinkers that contributed to the Constitution. And realistically, if we looked at the big picture, the people we're really trying to reach are the radical faction on the left. Young people with all of these new radical thoughts that are leaning over to two major factions, which is communism and Satanism. And how do you find common ground? Well, you introduce them to the radical faction, John Adams, that helped form the Constitution, and you let people know what was on his mind of why he thought it was important to overthrow the government, the King of England, and create a government that was designed to serve the people. I mean, that's what people are convinced communism is going to do, but history tells us that communism is not going to do anything for the people. It's going to create a monarchy, and they call it communism today, but it's not that different, any different than the monarchies of the kings of Europe that controlled the world for so many years, and religious factions that wanted to silence every other religious denomination. Okay, let's get into some quotes from John Adams. Human passions, unbridled by morality and religion, would break the strongest cords of the Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Well, basically meaning that if you don't have a good bearing on your morals, you're going to be against the Constitution. And that's what we're seeing today, is the faction that, I don't have to explain all the immoral factions that are trying to do away with the Constitution today. Okay, A second quote from John Adams. My adoration of the author of the universe is too profound and too sincere. The love of God and His creation, delight, joy, triumph, exaltation in my own experience. In other words, John Adams is confessing the fact that he knew God on a personal level. And of course, where do we get those morals from? But from God. And that's one thing that another step in trying to reach this radical left faction that, we'd love to be able to introduce them to God. And how do we do it? Well, we do it by praying about it and working with the Holy Spirit. Prosperity. You will never know how much it costs the present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make good use of it. If you do not, I shall repent in heaven that I ever took half the pains to preserve it. In other words, one of the main ways that we can reach this left radical faction is to show them the sacrifices that these people took to get this country free from England, and why it was important to oppose a monarchy and how dangerous it is to throw away the Constitution, throw away this government, and put us under the bonds of another monarchy in the form of communism and, of course, Satanism. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. In other words, John Adams didn't know anything about communism. It wasn't even created back then, but he knew a whole lot about monarchs, about kings who chose what religion everyone was going to follow and forced them. I mean, you know the history. And there's really no difference between them. Statesmen, my dear sir, may plan and speculate for liberty, but it is religion and morality alone which can establish the principles upon which freedom can securely stand. The only foundation is a free constitution is pure virtue. This is from an author of the Constitution. This is what he had in mind. This was his mindset. He prayed to know God. He prayed to be of a high moral standard, and he put this into the Constitution. No doubt about it. Power must never be trusted without a check. And this, we can see, is framed within the Constitution, broken into the different branches of government with what they call checks and balances, which is something that we learned about in school as children. And we're supposed to be able to see the checks and balances working today, but we're seeing a corrupt judicial system that's been bought and paid for by people with the intent of overthrowing the United States government. There is danger from all men. The only maxim of a free government ought to be to trust no man living with power to endanger the public liberty. In other words, don't trust anyone. Judge people by how they perform, not by the speeches they make, not by the promises they make, but by the actions that they actually perform once they take office. And if they don't live up to those promises, if they don't live up to the moral standards, then impeach them, get rid of them. There has to be a way of getting rid of these people quicker than what we have in the Constitution now. So that might be something to look forward to in the future. The jaws of power are always open to devour, and her arm is always stretched out, if possible, to destroy the freedom of thinking, speaking, and writing. We talked about censorship before. How did John Adams know this? It's been around, since the 1700s. I mean, when did he write this? 1770s, 1780s. It's, it's nothing new, but it's something we always have to fight against. That's why we have the First Amendment with the freedom of speech. Nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud is the only maxim which can ever preserve the liberties of any people. In other words, we got to use our freedom of speech. We got to point out when errors are being made, and somehow, we can't let these same people return to Congress for 50 years. Nip it in the bud. Power always thinks it has a great soul and vast views beyond the comprehension of the weak, and that it is doing God's service when it is violating all His laws. I mean, we see this time and time again. We see the radical left that basically mirrors everything Satan does, and unfortunately, we see too many people in government that treat people like they're some kind of idiots. Children shall be educated and instructed in the principles of freedom. That is important. Adams saw the value of education, and that's what we need to do. Unfortunately, we've got like a whole generation that's been influenced by radical influences in the education system, all the way from daycare all the way up through the highest levels of education in the universities. We see protesters coming out of the university. We see professors supporting Hamas, ISIS, all the radical Muslim factions. We see them supporting the communists. We see them worshiping communist leaders today and in the past. And unfortunately, we failed as a generation in educating the children in the principles of freedom. Liberty cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people. See, take it from John Adams. Education is important, and we have to get a hold of that again. Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There was never a democracy that did not commit suicide. John Adams read the philosophers, the Greek philosophers, Roman philosophers that wrote about democracy, republic, and everything else, and saw how they failed. And John Adams knew that with all the hard work that him and the 51 other people put into the Constitution, that it was always threatened by outside influences, mostly through the lack of education. Liberty, once lost, is lost forever. That is one thing that we have to keep in mind. We lose it, how are we going to get it back? But a constitution of government, once changed from freedom, can never be restored. Liberty, once lost, is lost forever. Cities may be rebuilt and a people reduce the poverty, but acquire fresh property. But a constitution of government once changed from freedom, can never be restored. John Adams saw war. He experienced war. He saw, as soon as the revolution started, the governors representing England confiscated all the property. Homes were burned down. Cities wiped out. Families wiped out. You can't restore lives. And in the same token, you cannot just restore the freedom that's been lost. Because power corrupts, society's demands for moral authority and character increase as the importance of the position increases. In other words, people we elect to office should have high morals. John Adams saw it. He saw, from all the delegates that were working on the Constitution, he saw people of high moral caliber, as well as people with no moral character. So, taking advice from a guy that's seen it all. Let us dare to read, think, speak, and write. Good advice from a guy that helped write the Constitution. Let's not just restrict our information to what we prefer to see, prefer to think, but realistically, if we're going to battle the forces of communism and Satanism, we need to know a little bit about the enemy. And we need to read, we need to think, we need to speak, and we need to write about it. So let's get on the internet and start using the ammunition and the resources we have today. The second author we're going to take a look at today is Thomas Jefferson, who's kind of more of the medium character, the medium influence. Thomas Jefferson, a man of great wisdom, a man of great learning, a man of high morals and high character that should be able to reach anyone in between the medium range of left and right, and especially, on the far right, who understand what Jefferson was getting to in a lot of these quotes. And the first one is, "Evil triumphs when good men do nothing." Really good quote. Everybody's seen it. Everybody's heard it. And Jefferson supplies a lot of quotes that people are familiar with. And then it's just a matter of explaining it a little deeper. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. This goes right in with the First Amendment, freedom of speech. If we don't use this freedom of speech, we're going to lose life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Common sense. That's exactly what Thomas Jefferson was a common sense man. You know well that government always kept a kind of standing army of news writers who, without any regard to truth or to what should be like truth, invented and put into the papers whatever might serve the government, ministers. This suffers with the mass of the people who have no means of distinguishing the false from the true paragraphs of a newspaper. Hey, come on. Thomas Jefferson wrote this back in the 1770s, 1780s. Back then, they used news printed newspapers as a weapon. As a matter of fact, during the Revolutionary War, the English used propaganda to turn the American Indians against the colonists. And the French did the same thing after the war, because the French had their sights on conquering the entire New World. So propaganda, news, printed lies, deceptions are nothing new. And, it might be a good thing to show this to people, to say, hey, this is nothing new, but we know history and we're prepared to fight it. The press is impotent when it abandons itself to falsehood. Okay, the press is useless when it prints lies. Realistically, this goes without saying, but we got to be able to know these quotes, because this is really what helped frame and construct the Constitution. We have the freedom of speech, but on the same token, we have to be able to distinguish truth from lies. And that's the problem we have today. We see what's going on with the news today. The God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. This is why we have freedom of religion. People can choose the wrong religion, they can choose the right religion, but without that liberty to choose, we're nothing as a nation. When the people are afraid of the government, that's tyranny. But when the government is afraid of the people, that's liberty. Thomas Jefferson again. These famous quotes, very useful. Free men do not ask permission to bear arms. Another famous quote from Thomas Jefferson. And there's reason behind it. The end of democracy and the defeat of the American Revolution will occur when government falls into the hands of leading institutions and moneyed corporations. Thomas Jefferson saw that. And you got to look at the aspect, the thought, and the experiences Thomas Jefferson saw in the Revolution. Because, all of the businesses were controlled by the governors that the king sent over, and those governors were paying the king a piece of the action, pay the big guy his 10%. And when the revolution broke out, there weren't a whole lot of, major corporations that supported the patriots. They supported the King of England. Or they tried to remain neutral, depending upon which side won, they tried to play it safe. But, corporations have their own interest in mind, and Thomas Jefferson lived through it. He saw it. He saw their reactions in the revolution, and he warned against the wolves in sheep clothing, or in his case, covered with money as camouflage. Does the government fear us, or do we fear the government? When the people fear the government, tyranny has found victory. Now let me read that again. When the people fear the government, tyranny has found victory. Okay, think about that for a moment. The federal government is our servant, not our master. Remember that. That's from Thomas Jefferson, one of the authors of the Constitution. I prefer dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery. This is one of the most famous quotes from Thomas Jefferson. Dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery. Did he write this before or after the Revolution? It We'd have to look it up. There is no justification for taking away individuals' freedom in the guise of public safety. We hear this all the time, especially when they attack the Second Amendment. And we're going to start hearing it. We hear it with the First Amendment too. We have to censor this stuff. We have to combat false information. You know what? Fake information was around long before the Constitution existed, and it's going to be around no matter what they do. It's not the government's job to decide what we can read and what we can't read. And it's certainly not the government's job to say, we got to take away firearms for your safety. Take it from Thomas Jefferson. Okay, when once a republic is corrupted, there is no possibility of redeeming any of the growing evils, but by removing the corruption and restoring its lost principles. Every other correction is either useless or a new evil. Take that into consideration next time you vote, and take a look at the track record of the person that is in office, the incumbent. Did they do a good job? Yeah, just because you vote them in again, you think they're going to change your moral standards? Now, this is probably my favorite quote from Thomas Jefferson. I even made a t-shirt with this one. Peace is that brief, glorious moment in history when everybody stands around reloading. In other words, Thomas Jefferson is pointing out the fact that, our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness comes at a price. When you abandon freedom to achieve security, you lose both and deserve neither. In other words, letting the government censor the internet, censor social media, or do whatever, you're gonna lose your freedom. You don't abandon your freedom to achieve security. You might have some different opinions on TikTok, which is, TikTok's a little bit different because it's focused as a weapon. Yeah, okay, we got the Second Amendment. We're not for any type of gun control. But look at it. There is some common sense with gun control. Firearms is one thing. Owning nuclear weapons or space defense things, in the private sector that can be weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of mass destruction do not belong in the hands of common people. What is TikTok? TikTok is a social media of mass destruction. Let's use some common sense here. Who will govern the governors? There is only one force in the nation that can be depended upon to keep the government pure and the government honest, and that is the people themselves. They alone, if well informed, are capable of preventing the corruption of power and of restoring the nation to its rightful course if it should go astray. They alone are the safest depository of the ultimate powers of government. This is one that, you should copy, print, put on your wall, be a great bumper sticker for a car. But this Thomas Jefferson did a great job of summing up the idea and the concept behind the Constitution. The power lies with the people. Experience has shown that even under the best forms of government, those entrusted with power have, in time and by slow operations, perverted it into tyranny. We see that today. Thomas Jefferson wrote this way back in the late 1700s. And nothing has really changed. So what we're seeing is nothing new, but we can learn how to best combat it by what? Studying the Constitution and reading our history. I think myself that we have more machinery of government that is necessary to many parasites living on the labor of the industrious. Government big enough to supply everything you need is big enough to take everything you have. The course of history shows that as a government grows, liberty decreases. The two enemies of the people are criminals and government. So let us lie the second down with the chains of the Constitution so that the second will not become the legalized version of the first. And what are we seeing today? We're seeing the same thing. We're seeing the administration siding with criminals, releasing criminals, putting criminals back on the streets within hours. We're even seeing judges and DAs who release criminals for carjacking getting carjacked by the criminals they just released. I mean, this is insanity. This is far beyond insanity. And way back, during the construction of the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson and the authors of the Constitution created the Constitution to make sure that did not happen. The issue today is the same as it has been throughout all history, whether man shall be allowed to govern himself or be ruled by a small elite. Thomas Jefferson has this way of summing things up with total common sense. That's why he's kind of like the mainstream statesman. When tyranny becomes law, rebellion becomes duty. And that's exactly what we're seeing today. We're seeing the government side with Hamas, side with the Palestinians, side with BLM, who tore apart entire cities, side with illegal immigrants. They're siding with the criminals. So what does Thomas Jefferson tell us to do? Rebellion. Which means, now that we have the Constitution, it means vote them people the hell out of office. Make sure their political careers are ended. The worst day in a man's life is when he sits down and begins thinking about how he can get something for nothing. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, it's beginning to look like Thomas Jefferson wrote the book on the left, or how to recognize the left, and what we should do about the influences from the left. The third and last author of the Constitution we're going to take a look at is George Washington, who provides a unique view. Basically the general of the Continental Army, leader of the Patriots, and the first president of the U.S. So, his qualifications are far right, to say the least. Anyway, we're going to take a look at what was behind George Washington's concept and his contributions to the Constitution. If we desire to avoid insult, we must be able to repel it. If we desire to secure peace, one of the most powerful instruments in our rising prosperity, it must be known that we are all at all times ready for war. Hey, this is coming from, a general, so you got to consider the source, but, this basically explains why George Washington agreed that the First Amendment should have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the Second Amendment shall be the right to bear arms. The eyes of all our countrymen are now upon us, and we shall have their blessings and praises, if happily we are the instruments of saving them from the tyranny mediated against them. Let us therefore animate and encourage each other, and show the whole world that a free man contending for liberty on his own ground is superior to any slavish mercenary on earth. Well, one of the things you got to know about the English is they hired mercenaries from Germany and other countries to fight against George Washington and his patriotic army, fighting on their own land for life, liberty, and eventually the Constitution they were going to create. So keep that in mind. George Washington, the general, a free man fighting for liberty, can basically take on any force. If freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter. Good quote from George Washington. Take it, share it, use it. No people can be bound to acknowledge the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than people in the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. If you read some of the stories about George Washington and the battles that he faced and everything else, the original old authors kept on insisting that God's hand was in a lot of those battles. And you can read history and find it out yourself, and maybe that's a good thing to use when you're trying to reach people on the left. Strive not with your superiors in argument, but always submit your judgment to others with modesty. You just thought I'd throw that one in there from George Washington. Real men despise battle, but will never run from it. That's true. Nobody wants war, but, when it comes to either a fight or submitting to tyranny, there's really not a choice for real men. There is nothing so likely to produce peace as to be well prepared to meet the enemy. This is George Washington's thoughts behind the Second Amendment, as well as were shared by a number of the delegates when they decided to describe and enshrine the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, followed by the right to bear arms. Associate yourself with men of good quality if you esteem your own reputation, for it's better to be alone than in bad company. 99% of failures come from people who make excuses. The harder the conflict, the greater the triumph. This is all good advice from George Washington, the general of the first general of the U.S. Army and first president of the United States. The nation which indulges towards another a habitual hatred or a habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interest. In other words, what George Washington learned from life is don't be afraid to take a look at both sides of the subject. And this goes hand in hand with Jefferson's warning about the press, the news. So when we look at it, George Washington is basically telling us that the leftist news that only looks at one side and refuses to look at the other side is already living in slavery. Our own country's honor all call upon us for a vigorous and manly exertion. And if we now shamefully fail, we shall become infamous to the whole world. Let us therefore rely upon the goodness of the cause and the aid of a superior being in whose hands victory is to animate and encourage us to great and noble actions. Victory is to animate and encourage us to great and noble actions. In other words, George Washington, like a lot of the other authors of the Constitution, had a faith in God. And he's giving the credit to God for his victories, telling us that if we don't rely on God for every step of our fight, we're not going anywhere. There is nothing which can better deserve our patronage than the promotion of science and literature. Knowledge in every country, the surest basis of public happiness. George Washington believed in looking at both sides of the subject, gathering knowledge. God gave us a brain, and even Paul used the word judgment and explained that it was the duty to the people that were listening to him, the early patriots of the scriptures, to look at people and use the word judgment to look at their actions and to gather the information. And to gather information on people to decide whether or not they're for real or just deceptions. Liberty, when it begins to take root, is a plant of rapid growth. I'll die on my feet before I'll live on my knees. So now you know where that saying comes from. George Washington. We should not look back unless it is to derive useful lessons from past errors and for the purpose of profiting by dearly bought experience. Experience comes at a price. My dad always said it's better to learn from someone else's mistakes than make them on your own. Of course, somebody else probably said that long before my dad did, but you get the general impression. Guard against the imposters of pretend patriotism. Oh, that we have to do. I mean, we even have a name for them today. It's called rhinos. There's only a handful of people that are actually in Congress that are real patriots. And then there's other ones that like to make speeches like patriots, but we just don't see them. We don't see any action on them. And, George Washington warned about that as, the first president of the United States. No punishment, in my opinion, is too great for the man who can build his greatness upon his country's ruin. I don't need to explain this one, do I? A primary object should be the education of our youth in the science of government in a republic. What species of knowledge can be equally important, and what duty more pressing than communicating it to those who are to be the future guardians of the liberties of our country? Unfortunately, we've allowed the left, the communists, the elite business owners and everything to infiltrate the education system, and we're in rather sad shape. And we have to replace that with the education of a true republic. Where are our men of abilities? Why did they not come forth to save our country? Self-explanatory. Well, we just took a look at a number of quotes from three of the authors that help contribute ideas and concepts to the Constitution of the United States, and we got an idea of what was on their mind and what they experienced in life. And we're also, I was surprised to see that, it was like they could tell the future. And they could see the problems that we're actually facing today. So, thanks for tuning in. And if you liked it, don't forget to share. Don't forget to leave a comment. Take a look at the links. And, let's start getting this information out. And let's start educating the people that are at least interested in trying to find out what is this Constitution all about, and who wrote it, and why did they think this was important to put in there. So keep up the prayers, keep up the faith, keep up the hard work, and use that freedom of speech while we still have it.